My Gavanen Melonin, and well met indeed. I am Arakir Galadurthan, the head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, but welcome back to another lore video as we delve into the backstory of the Lord of the Rings. Today we're dealing with Boromir's younger brother, Faramir. So keeping sort of with the Fellowship theme, but changing a little is of course Faramir. So, straight in, Faramir was 5 years younger than Boromir, not 2, as I erroneously said in the last video on his brother. He was born in 2983 of the Third Age, which again is roughly 35-40-ish years before the War of the Ring. So Faramir was only 5 when his mother Finduilas passes away, whereas Boromir was 10. So even younger for Faramir would have been an even bigger blur to him, I should imagine. And of course, when Finduilas passed away, Denethor turned very grim indeed, almost as though his joy and love of life was taken when she went. And Boromir becomes something of a favoured child to Denethor. Various reasons as well could partake in this, in that throughout Faramir and Boromir's youth, Gandalf is quite a frequent visitor to Minas Tirith, and Faramir is very keen to learn all he can from Gandalf. So whereas Boromir had a real love of battle from the outset, Faramir had a love of arts and lore and knowledge. But that's not to say that Faramir was not an excellent warrior, as we shall see later on, but certainly in his youth he took to study more than war. And this only aided Denethor's bias toward Boromir. And indeed later on he even mocks him by calling him a wizard's pupil. It is unquestionable that Denethor favours Boromir, so it could be subjectively assumed, my opinion, that perhaps Denethor then treated Faramir worse throughout their childhood, and it's certainly, with the actions later on, I think they corroborate that story. But despite the favouritism toward Boromir, a very strong bond develops between the brothers, and they grow up very close together indeed. So Faramir, much like Boromir, spends most of his youth out of the story. We just know that he becomes an skilled warrior, and he's not doing that by shooting test dummies. He's fighting against Mordor in and on the eastern banks of the Anduin, and he joins us properly again at the Battle of Osgiliath, which is described in more detail, obviously. The Boromir video, the defenders of Gondor are defeated. They are routed back over the western side of Osgiliath, and as the defenders finally abandon the eastern part, they destroy the last bridge of Osgiliath. And Faramir, Boromir, and 2 unnamed others then survive on the eastern bank until the bridge is destroyed, at which point they dive into the Anduin and swim back to western Osgiliath. As I say, only 4 survived. Expanding further on the notion of who defeated them, Boromir later on at the council obviously explains that it wasn't through sheer numbers that Mordor won, but the coming of a great evil. And in the history of Middle-earth we get the following phrase, that the Ringwraiths issued once more from Minas Morgul in visible form, and the sons of Denethor resisted them, but were defeated by the Black Captain. And I think it could be assumed that the Black Captain was, of course, the Witch King. It expands further and says, "But this very year, in the days of June, sudden war came upon us out of Mordor, and we were swept away. We were outnumbered, for Mordor has allied itself with the Easterlings and the cruel Haradrim. But it was not by numbers that we were defeated, a power was there that we have not felt before. Some said that it could be seen, like a great black horseman, a dark shadow under the moon. Wherever he came, a madness filled our foes, but fear fell on our boldest, so that horse and man gave way and fled. Only a remnant of our eastern force came back, destroying the last bridge that still stood amid the ruins of Osgiliath. I was in the company that held the bridge until it was cast down behind us. 4 only were saved by swimming, my brother, myself, and 2 others." So that's Boromir recanting the tale at the Council of Elrond. So you can see that it is heavily implied that the Witch King is the reason that they lose eastern Osgiliath. So then, of course, we come to the dream. And Boromir and Faramir both have the dream, but it's notable that Faramir has it multiple times and Boromir has it but once. And of course this is a dream that tells them to seek for Imladris because Isildur's Bane is found. And Boromir obviously eventually goes, joining the Fellowship. But a point on this, again personal opinion, just to spice up some thought in you, is that knowing what we do later on about Faramir's, shall we call it, purity, could it therefore be argued that the reason the dream came to him many times is a sign of some form of divine intervention. We know that, spoiler alert, everyone knows, it doesn't matter. We know that Faramir rejects the temptation of the ring, but Boromir did not. And it cannot therefore be coincidence, unless it purely is Tolkien just painting Faramir as a more noble soul. But Faramir gets the dream multiple times, telling him to head for Imladris. The dream then comes to Boromir once, and Boromir then goes. And we later learn, of course, that Faramir rejects the ring. It's interesting. There's no information to back this story up. It is purely subjective again. But it is interesting to think that it could well be the input of, I wouldn't say Eru Ilúvatar, but perhaps maybe the input of someone like Lórien, for example, who is obviously the Valar of dreams in a way, maybe trying to issue Faramir forth because they know that he would succeed where Boromir would, in inverted commas, fail. But anyway, that's speculative and food for thought. So after the Battle of Osgiliath, obviously but Faramir stays on the western bank for some time. So this is after the initial battle. They actually head back to Minas Tirith to discuss their dream, and Boromir, of course, rides north. Faramir returns to the western bank of Osgiliath because it is here that he then rejoins the story upon seeing the funeral boat of his brother pass by. So Faramir is the first in Gondor, I am of the understanding, to see Boromir's boat and to learn of Boromir's death. Sometime thereafter, this event that happens at nightfall, and he stays on the western bank of Osgiliath for a while, just defending Osgiliath from any would-be attacks, but of course none do come until the ultimate attack. Sometime thereafter, though, he does head off to command the Rangers of Ithilien out of Denethor, the secret cave in Ithilien. And it is here that he then joins the story proper, as of course he leads the attack on the column of Haradrim that are passing to the Black Gate. Now at this time, Damrod and Mablung have already discovered Frodo and Sam, and because Frodo and Sam and Damrod and Mablung, to apologise for the repetition, they all watch Faramir and his troops take down the Mumak and they don't take it down, but it runs away. But they watch them harass and kill all of the Haradrim. So it doesn't happen as it does in the film that they are suddenly found by Faramir then and there. But anyway, so they cross paths, and Faramir leads them back to Denethor. Now, before he leads them back, he does say that he really should take them to Minas Tirith, but they're strangers in this land. They should be taken to the High Council and to the Steward to decide what to do with them. But he decides he needs more time to think on what should be done with the hobbits, and that's why they return to Denethor, for it is only 10 miles away from where they ambush the Haradrim column. In Denethor, we learn something I think really interesting, and that is that despite the fact that Boromir and Faramir both have this dream that speaks of Isildur's Bane, no one in Gondor assumes Isildur's Bane means the One Ring, because, and Faramir says it quite explicitly, they knew that Isildur was killed by orc arrows, so they had absolutely no idea what Isildur's Bane meant. To read another passage from the book, speaking again of Isildur's Bane, we get to see another snippet here of Boromir's determination to go for the ring, and some suggestion that actually Denethor did have a say in who journeyed to Rivendell. For it says, "What in truth this thing is, I cannot yet guess, but some heirloom of power and peril it must be. A fell weapon perchance devised by the Dark Lord. If it were a thing that gave advantage in battle, I can well believe that Boromir, the proud and fearless, often rash, ever anxious for the victory of Minas Tirith, might desire such a thing and be allured by it. Alas, that ever he went on that errand. I should have been chosen by my father and the elders, but he put himself forward, and he would not be stayed." So this is what Faramir says to Frodo in Denethor upon seeing the ring, and of course not knowing what it is. So he's guessing that it's a weapon of the Dark Lord. And then, as I say, it then gives a little bit of insight into the fact that Boromir put himself forward, and then he would not be stayed. But he also says, "I should have been chosen by my father and the elders," suggesting that even though Boromir's determination sent him north, there was also push from Denethor and the elders to also go north. Yeah, I just think that's quite interesting. Then, of course, Faramir famously denies the temptation of this thing before he knows what it is. So do remember that. He doesn't fully know it's the ring yet. He denies it regardless, and he says to Frodo, "But fear no more. I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway. Not were Minas Tirith falling in ruin, and I alone could save her, so using the weapon of the Dark Lord for her good and my glory. No, I do not wish for such triumphs, Frodo, son of Drogo. So Faramir's not really aware of what it actually is when he does that, and he just thinks it's a powerful weapon. But then he does discover its true nature through conversation with Frodo and Sam, and the introduction of Gollum, who comes in a little bit later. Because when Frodo and Sam are captured by Faramir, Gollum is not present, and Gollum obviously follows, and then the Rangers capture him later. And so there is that scene where Faramir's ordering him being killed, saying, "Do you know who this is?" And Frodo, of course, eventually says, "No, he's our guide," blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so then Faramir then says the following once he finally knows what the ring is. So he says, "So it seems. So that is the answer to all the riddles. The one ring that was thought to have perished from the world, and Boromir tried to take it by force. And you escaped, and ran all the way to me. And here in the wild I have you, 2 halflings and a host of men at my call, and the Ring of Rings. A pretty stroke of fortune, a chance for Faramir, captain of Gondor, to show his quality." He stood up, very tall and stern, his eyes glinting. Oh, he has grey eyes, that's interesting. His grey eyes glinting. So there Faramir learns what the ring actually is, and he gives the same speech that you do here in the film. But, unlike Boromir, as I say, Faramir denies the temptation. He holds true to his word, and he lets Frodo and Sam go. Even after the small debacle that happens with Gollum, he still lets them go. They tell him that they're going to go to Cirith Ungol, and he counsels that they should not do that, but they resolve to go nevertheless. Faramir also actually does them a solid, to use gangster terms, and he refills their pack with food and supplies, and he gives each of them a walking stave, a fresh walking stave, which is quite nice, isn't it? And then they're led out of Heneth Anun, and they are all blindfolded, for Faramir says that Smeagol must be blindfolded, but that Frodo and Sam don't need to be. But of course, Frodo, keeping Gollum on his side and showing pity for him, says, "Blindfold us all and walk us out." So that's what happens. And Faramir walks them to the edge, or just to somewhere in Ithilien, and sends them on their way. So Faramir then returns to Minas Tirith from Heneth Anun. And interestingly, even though it's only him and about 4 riders, when he crosses the Pelennor coming to Minas Tirith, he's attacked by winged Nazgul. So even though Western Osgiliath, the Causeway Forts, the Ramas Ekor are all still held by Gondor, the winged Nazgul here, obviously, are able to fly around at will and are just spreading fear amongst the Gondorians, I should imagine. And indeed, as I say, as Faramir returns to Minas Tirith, he's attacked. And Gandalf bursts out of Minas Tirith, and his blinding light from his staff scares the Nazgul away, for the Black Captain, or the Witch King, is not amongst their number. And it's said that the Witch King actually is a match for Gandalf, but that, of course, is a video for another time. So when Faramir returns to Gondor, he recants that he parted with Frodo not 2 days earlier. So it's 2 days until he gets to Minas Tirith, and he camps at Caer Andros on the night in between. So I think he gets to Minas Tirith on the evening of the 2nd day, having met Frodo on the morning of the 1st day, or let Frodo go on the morning of the 1st day. And he spends that night in Caer Andros, which is the other crossing point of the Anduin north of Osgiliath. And this is where he then butts heads with Denethor, and it is here that Denethor then finally says that he had wished Boromir had lived, and that Faramir had been the one to die. And he says, "So be it," cried Denethor, "but not with your death only, Lord Faramir, with the death also of your father and of all your people, whom it is your part to protect now that Boromir is gone." He's speaking of the fact that Faramir did not bring this great gift. "Do you wish then," said Faramir, "that our places had been exchanged?" "And yes, I wish that indeed," said Denethor, "for Boromir was loyal to me and no wizard's pupil. He would have remembered his father's need and would not have squandered what fortune gave. He would have brought me a mighty gift." Now, the wizard's pupil part here as well is compounded, because during this speech, of course, Gandalf and Pippin are present with Denethor, and Faramir essentially gives his entire military report and his entire event report to Gandalf. He barely looks at Denethor, and Denethor even makes mention of that slightly earlier. So there's still this raging animosity between Denethor and Gandalf. And I'm sure as well, for all of Denethor's madness, again, my opinion, for all of his madness and for all of his favouritism towards Boromir, it still would have been jealousy that made him dislike Gandalf Because, of course, he would have wanted his son to show him affection, even if it wasn't his favourite son. I mean, surely. So it may just be a jealousy thing as well that Gandalf gets Faramir's attention so much. But anyway, that's just my opinion again. So after this little debacle, Faramir is sent back to Osgiliath by Denethor, as Denethor says that he would not yield the river and Pelennor unfought. So he sends Faramir back. But now, a break from the movie here. Faramir doesn't charge an now already captured Osgiliath and die to arrow fire in front of it. Osgiliath is still held, at least the western side, by Gondor. So he's just returning to resume command. That's all, really. Gandalf does say to him, though, that heading out there is folly and do not throw your life away. But Faramir says, of course, I must go. I must still obey my lord and my city. So the Witch King then finally sallies out of Minas Morgul with all his force, and Faramir's garrison at Osgiliath is overrun as the orcs, very unexpectedly, come upon the garrison by boat. So Osgiliath is swiftly defeated, being outnumbered 10-1. The Gondorians retreat to what is called the Causeway Forts, which is part of the great Ramas Echor, which is a large walled ring around Minas Tirith and encompassing the fields of the Pelennor. It has a completely practical purpose. The fields of the Pelennor are the breadbasket of Minas Tirith. They are literal farming fields. And so the Ramas Echor protects the food source of Minas Tirith. And that's where Faramir then falls back with Osgiliath. With the defenders of Osgiliath, sorry. We learn at this point as well that it is said the enemy fears the Witch King more than the blades of their enemies, and that it is even said that they would kill themselves upon his bidding. They are that afraid of him. And so that gives you an idea of how really powerful and awe-inspiring the Witch King is to his own forces, and how terrifying he is to their enemy. So back at the Causeway Forts, the defenders try and hold again, but again they lose, and they lose quite significantly. Now the full force of Mordor is on the western bank. Various places the wall is brought down, and the orcs stream into the Pelennor, and Faramir organises a retreat. Certain men do start retreating and running back to Minas Tirith, and throughout the day of this fighting, there's a constant stream almost of defenders running away from the Ramas Echor. But then finally, ere night falls, Faramir can be seen, and the last defenders of the Ramas Echor and the Causeway Forts march back to Minas Tirith in formation. Faramir manages to keep them together, even though they're being harassed by the enemy and by, of course, the Nazgul. But then they break. So this company of defenders, the last defenders, gloriously outfitted in Gondorian mail and with the banners waving high, marching back across the Pelennor with Faramir behind them, organising the retreat. Suddenly the orcs and Southrons, thousands of them, bearing torches and banners, stream into the Pelennor. And at that point, the Nazgul then set upon the retreating army with, of course, their fell beasts. And so this company immediately breaks and begins scattering all across the Pelennor, people frantically running back to Minas Tirith for their lives. And all of this is being watched from Minas Tirith by Denethor, who is still in control of all of his faculties and is the current lord still of the city and the defenders. And he and all of the defenders watch as Faramir's force is cut down. But eventually, Denethor softens and releases what is known as the sortie. And of course, this moment of the story is one of the finest. And finally, Gandalf, all of the mustered cavalrymen of Minas Tirith, and of course the famed Knights of the Silver Swan, led by Prince Imrahil himself, burst forth from the gates of Minas Tirith, cross the Pelennor in lightning speed and bear down on the orcs and the Southrons. And it is said that the coming of the Silver Swan, not really, I'm biased towards them, the coming of the sortie, Gondorians and Dol Amrothians, is such that the attacking forces then turn and the hunters become the hunted. The Gondorians who were retreating regroup and also then assist, and they begin attacking and slaughtering the orcs and Southrons who were chasing them. But more troops then file into the Pelennor, and of course the Nazgul regroup their army, and then so the cavalrymen and the retreating army then regroup and begin returning to Minas Tirith, and they all get back. But just before Imrahil and the Swan Knights can arrive to save the column, Faramir is defending the rear guard from what is simply just called a champion of the Southrons. So he's in a one-on-one duel with a major leader of the Southrons, or a major warrior, and as the Swan Knights are coming down upon them, Faramir is shot with either an arrow or a dart, because dart is used very interchangeably with arrow throughout the book, so that's an argument point there. Argue that as you will. So it's either a dart, i.e. a blow dart, for example, or it is just an arrow. But either way, it's poisonous and it strikes him down. And it is only the coming of Imrahil who actually saves him, for the Swan Knights arrive just as the champion is about to, I assume, behead him. I don't know why I'd assume that, but when I read it, I always see it as the champion is about to behead him as he lay on the floor. But maybe there's no real basis for that. But anyway, Imrahil comes upon the champion, finishes him, and then scoops Faramir up, and the entire column returns to Minas Tirith, with Imrahil at the back carrying Faramir. So Faramir is then brought up to Denethor on the highest level, and Denethor, seeing his son, retreats within himself very much. He doesn't outright lose his mind yet, but he's really teetering on the edge, and he commands that Faramir just be laid in a chamber near to him in the great palace. And Denethor then climbs the White Tower of Ecthelion and looks into the Palantir one last time, and it is now that he loses his mind. For Sauron, of course, who is on the other end of all the Palantir, having something of a monopoly on the telephone lines in Middle-earth, he convinces Denethor that defeat is inevitable for the Gondorians, and he should just end it all. And this event is what finally tips Denethor over. So seeing his remaining son on his deathbed, and then coupled with visions from Sauron that say your defeat is inevitable, your city will fall, Denethor then loses everything. But he doesn't quite turn to the pyre yet. He sits next to Faramir's body for a long time, almost brooding, just sitting, staring. And of course, all the while, Faramir is dying to the poison within him. But then messengers then come up from the lower levels to say that Minas Tirith is breached and the lower levels are in flames. And this then is the final event. Denethor then resolves to have himself and Faramir burned. And I quote, "as the heathen kings ere ever a ship sailed from the west." So he wants to burn in the manner of the non-Númenóreans, the indigenous folk who populated the lands of Gondor before the Númenóreans claimed them fully. And so he leads the funeral procession out past the Fen Holland, the shut gate, or the closed gate as it's called, which leads to the tomb area of Minas Tirith, which can only be opened upon command of the steward or the king. And so the gate is opened and they pass into the Rath Dinan, which is the silent street. And there he commands a pyre be built around them in one of just the rooms there, with Faramir laying on the pyre. He stands upon it and he commands that his servants then bring, obviously, wood and oil to burn. Pippin is amongst their number this entire time, however, and it's now that Pippin then runs off to try and find Gandalf, because of course Pippin knows that Faramir is not yet dead, and it would be folly for them to burn like this. But before Pippin finds Gandalf, he finds Beregond, one of the captains, or just one of the Citadel Guard actually, and he tells Beregond of what is happening. Faramir is about to be burned alive, and so Beregond is then very torn between his solemn duty to not leave his post. The Citadel Guard cannot leave the posts they are commanded to unless on an order of the king or the steward. And obviously the steward's not going to order him, but he knows that Faramir is about to die, and he's very loyal to Faramir. And so Pippin leaves him when he's got this conundrum going on in his mind, and Pippin runs off to find Gandalf. And they come back all the way up to the top level, and as they return to the room where Faramir is about to be burned, they find Beregond fighting Gondorians on the doorstep, having slain 2 already to stop them sending wood into the room. So Beregond essentially commits treason against his king, for it's treasonous to leave his post, such is their duty, against his steward, and he commits murder in the defence of Faramir. Which is no small feat. So very loyal to Faramir indeed. He knows the consequences of his actions. And indeed, just to touch upon Beregond, he is essentially arrested, stripped of his post as Citadel Guardsman, but Aragorn appoints him later on, so spoiler alert, Faramir survives, Aragorn appoints him later on as Faramir's personal bodyguard. So his loyalty is repaid tenfold. but he is no longer a member of the Citadel Guard, so he does lose that accolade. But anyway, of course, Gandalf then bursts into the room. He just talks with Denethor, and then it's said that Gandalf then shows his true might as he leaps upon the pyre and carries Faramir off, placing him on a bier and beginning to walk him away to the Houses of Healing. So Denethor then follows after, and the image I get of Denethor here is very much a complete madman. He's shaking, he's shriveled over, and he's so grim as he watches Faramir be carried off. And this is when he cries out, "Do not take my son from me." And he follows Gandalf and the bier as it passes back towards the main 7th level, away from the Rathdenan. And here he pulls out the Palantir and a knife, and it's assumed again that he is trying to kill Faramir. And he is denied killing Faramir by Beregond again, and this is when he then returns to the pyre, resolves to essentially kill himself. He sets a fire to the pyre and then jumps upon it after he started it burning. So he's really keen on ending everything. And so rather than running off the end of the rock formation atop Minas Tirith, he just dies upon the pyre in flame, and so passes Denethor, son of Icthelion. Faramir is then, of course, rushed to the Houses of Healing, and he lays there for a while, until, of course, the coming of the king. For before Aragorn is truly king, he sneaks into the city with this express purpose of healing both Faramir and Éowyn, and this he does. And then Aragorn returns back outside the city, and then they head off, because he's not crowned king, obviously, until after the fall of Sauron. But for a brief moment after the victory at the siege of Minas Tirith, Aragorn sneaks into the city just to heal those in the Houses of Healing, which is also in the Aragorn video, really. But it is something of an omen, because there's a link between the king being able to heal in Gondor, and so those that look upon him suggest you surely must be the king to have such healing ability, and of course he is. So Faramir spends the remainder of the War of the Ring in the Houses of Healing in Minas Tirith, where he meets and falls in love with Éowyn of Rohan, and shortly after the end of the war, the two are married. Faramir surrenders his position as steward almost immediately upon Aragorn's return to Minas Tirith, and Aragorn becomes the new king. And shortly thereafter, however, Faramir is reappointed as the steward, but in the steward's originally intended role. And that is, of course, as a secondary in command should the king be unavailable. I mean, what happens when the king goes on holiday? Who's he going to direct his out of office to if no one's the steward? So, of course, he needs Faramir. So Faramir becomes the steward, and it becomes made a hereditary position. He and Éowyn head off to Ithilien, where he is now named the new Prince of Ithilien, and they settle down in the lands of Emun Arnon, which is a line of hills that border the east bank of the Anduin in sort of central southern Ithilien, and that is where he resides, becoming known as the Lord of Emun Arnon. So he is now the steward, the Prince of Ithilien, and the Lord of Emun Arnon. He and Éowyn are known to have at least one son, known as Elberon. They may have had more children, it's just not written. And finally, in the 82nd year of the Fourth Age, at the age of 120, Faramir passes away. For both Boromir and Faramir were about 40-ish at the time of the War of the Ring. So, obviously, he lives for another 80-odd years. It does very well. But he finally passes away in peace. So that concludes the tale of Faramir. But one point that I'm not clear on, and I couldn't find answers to in my reading, is whether or not the Prince of Ithilien is as like the Prince of Dol Amroth in statute and power. And indeed, does Ithilien become a principality as Dol Amroth is, or is it merely an honorific title and nothing more? I couldn't see the answer to that, so if anyone has any clues, do let me know. But otherwise, that is it. That is Faramir's story. So I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you wish to, I'm always welcome to hear your feedback and the points at which I say something incorrectly, which is always when I go off-piste. But there we are. And I'm hoping that... I think what I will do is round out the tale of the Fellowship first, and then I will do these planned videos detailing the differences betwixt books and film. But first of all, I'd like to cover each of the Fellowship in turn. And so we've only really got Gandalf and the Hobbits left. So I'll see what I'll do about that. But until we speak again, dear friends, Nevar Neden Perimad Melunin, and farewell.